So, as early as the 1850s, Italians were lured to Australia by the prospects of economic prosperity on the goldfields of Victoria, while others settled in the north of Queensland, where they worked in blue-collar jobs on farms and in mines. Although Italians could migrate to Australia because they were of European birth, their increasing presence within the community was a cause of concern for large sections of Australian society. As we heard throughout the conference, Australian history is marked with what Kay Saunders has referred to as entrenched doctrines of racial pride and superiority, epitomised by race riots, royal commissions, restrictive immigration policies, and a history of oppression and inequality against Aboriginal Australians. Though racism is often constructed as white attitudes to people of colour, Caucasian groups were frequently classified and ranked according to perceived social status in racial terms and subjected to discrimination and violence in several cases. The Italian-Australian community was increasingly seen to be a group of racially inferior, dirty Dago pests seeking to take over the farms and livelihoods of true Britishers. The British view of Italians was hierarchical, and Southern Europeans, including Italians and Greeks, were generally considered to be inferior status to their Anglo counterparts. Ethnic groups were ranked by varying degrees of whiteness, with Anglo-Caucasians at the pinnacle, followed by Western Europeans, then Southern and Eastern European white nationalities, and lastly non-Caucasian so-called black races at the bottom. There were further regional distinctions, as we've heard, with subnational divisions within the Italian community itself, and southern regions of Italy seem to be of lesser racial standing than their northern counterparts. Now, although the Italian community in Australia had been the subject of xenophobia and racial prejudices, the outbreak of the Second World War led to their portrayal as an insidious threat to the nation and the British Empire. Pre-existing racialised stereotypes and perceptions and ideas were exacerbated and recast in light of the war to create what Paddy Hilliard has referred to as a suspect community. Though Hilliard wrote about the experience of the Irish community living in Britain during the Troubles, it is a concept that fits the Australian-Italian experience during World War II as well. With Italy's declaration of war against the Allies in June 1940, the Italian community in Australia were left in a precarious position given that they were now considered enemy aliens within the community. They were subject to the National Security Aliens Control Regulations, which covered all manners of restrictions from limitation of access to vehicles and radio equipment to internment. In total, roughly 10% of the Italian population in Australia were interned at some point during the war, particularly in areas considered to be at high risk of invasion, such as North Queensland. The war saw these perceptions of the Italian community as inferior recast in the wartime climate, with the increasing fear of Japanese invasion following the attacks on Pearl Harbor and the Philippines in December 1941, adding to wartime prejudice experienced by the community. In addition to personal accusations which made up the deluge of cheap sneers and ill-bred sarcasm levelled at the population, a primary point of concern for the Australian community was the idea that the Italians within Australia would form a fifth column to subvert the war effort by means of espionage, sedition and sabotage. It was this fear of subversive action, particularly in less populated and vital regions such as Queensland and Western Australia, which largely contributed to the evident geographic differences in severity of anti-Italian prejudice which may be identified within the Australian community. A woman from regional Queensland wrote to the Prime Minister at the time, noting that the north of Queensland is practically in the hands of the Italians, our enemies. This is also the north of Australia, while our own men leave the district to fight in one of the forces, leaving our enemies ready to hand over the country to the Allies. The stance was echoed at an official level, with the councillor of the Protestant Labor Party arguing to Prime Minister Menzies that the truth is, not 1 in 100 will give assistance. They know full well of Mussolini's friendship with Japan. They have not come to this country to get away from fascist Italy, but to capture North Queensland, if not Australia, by peaceful penetration for their Independent councillor in Beale wrote to Curtin arguing that there was no doubt that the Japanese bombing of Broome made use of intelligence likely provided to them by local enemy aliens, including Italians. In one case, an official report was filed regarding an Italian woman living on a farm next to Australia's Northern Military Command. The woman was suspected of training her chickens to make signs of visible from the sky to guide enemy bombers in attack on the neighbouring headquarters. Though this is laughable to us in hindsight, the fear of invasion and the enemy within was very real at the time, and in some cases defied all reason and logic of peacetime. In the wartime climate, Italians were recast as the enemy within, cunningly conspiring to destroy the Anzac spirit and steal the hard-earned livelihoods of Australian soldiers and their families. In this climate, Italian Australians were left in a sticky situation. If they supported their homeland, they would be seen as traitors to their adoptive home. But if they overtly supported Australia and the British Empire, they could be seen by their fellow Italian community as turning their backs on their ethnicity. How did they reconcile their heritage with their existence in Australia, and how did they choose to define their identity? Some Italian Australians, particularly those born in Australia to Italian migrants, associated a sense of not belonging and the linking of negative enemy status with their Italian heritage and identity, and made moves to reject their Italian heritage and assimilate into Australian society. Many Australianised their names and married out of the Italian community, with one Italian man explaining that he chose to marry an Australian to fight his background because he had had enough of Italians. Others chose to suppress their Italian identity in public life, instead claiming various nationalities such as French and Swiss to avoid prejudice and secure work. For many within the Italian Australian community, one of the greatest complicating factors was the issue of fascism. Although there was a strong pro-fascist group within the community, it is difficult to determine the true degree of support within the entirety of the community. For many Italian Australians, it represented a beacon for Italian patriotism, with the fascist party seen as champions of Italian rights, particularly in conjunction with representatives of the Catholic Church in Queensland. The outbreak of war complicated these patriotic sentiments, with support for fascism and Mussolini seen to correlate with disloyalty to Australia and the war effort. Fremantle-born Nancy Fiocco, a teenager during the war years, attested to the disjointed sense of belonging which came with the declaration of war between Italy and Australia. She noted that it was quite confusing because before that we were thinking about Mussolini and how brave he was. And all of a sudden, war breaks out and your loyalties had to change. Here we are, we're Italians one moment and we're quite proud of Mussolini, and next minute, here's my brother going off to fight him. Another unnamed Italian woman wrote of how all she wanted as a child was to be like the rest of the children at school, the Australian children. Noting that her family's Italian heritage and father's fascist adherence had a dreadful effect on her sense of identity. Many within the Italian Australian community therefore sought to distance themselves from fascism and its supporters, to emphasise their Australian identity and allegiances and avoid internment, with a Sydney fruiterer telling authorities he had let go of one of his staff because he was a known fascist. In the words of that anonymous Italian woman, they were living in Australia, and Australia was their country, not Italy. Others chose to emphasise their Italian identities and challenge their treatment by the Australian community and government. Rather than rejecting their Italian heritage to fit within broader Australian society, some embraced their Italianness and extolled the Italian not as the dirty Dago pests they were represented as, but as veritable supermen who worked incessantly to save money and provide for their families. Notably, some within the Italian Australian community sought to reduce the suspicion of Italian Australians by uniting against the real menace, Japan. In a letter to the RSL's Texas branch, a Mr. Benuto highlighted hatred and suspicion of the Japanese by suggesting that responsible and truly patriotic Australians seek the release of internees with whom they should unite to defend Australia against the so-called Yellow Menace. In his eyes, Australia was chasing the shadow instead of the substance through its continued internment of Italians and imposition of restrictions under the National Security Acts. Ultimately, Benuto aimed to show that the Italian was nothing but an imagined threat compared to the Japanese who had bombed and threatened Australia, revealing their identity as the real threat. The most difficult questions of identity were perhaps faced by those Italians who enlisted in the Australian Armed Forces. Almost 1,400 individuals, 1,392, listed Italy as their place of birth on their enlistment papers. In total, almost one in five Italian men of enlistment age enlisted, with most serving in the army. Although their motivations for enlistment varied from the financial to the search for an adrenaline rush, the choice to enlist in the armed forces represented for many of these individuals a decision about their identity. Importantly, the choice to enlist in the Australian forces was just that, a choice. Conscription was not enforced in Australia as it was in Britain, and as British historian Wendy Ugolini has asserted, the introduction of the National Service Armed Forces Act in Britain removed the choice of whether to enlist or not, thereby freeing British Italians from having to choose an allegiance to either Britain or their Italian heritage. The absence of conscription in Australia forced Italian Australians to make a conscious decision not only to serve, but also about their allegiances and their identity. By choosing to enlist, these individuals were by proxy defending a nation that had in turn friends and family because of Italian origins and their perceived threat. Often military service was used as a method of demonstrating loyalty to Australia and the British Empire. In many cases, Italian men who were later enlisted to serve in the armed forces following release, as a way of demonstrating their loyalty. Similarly, Italian families pointed to the military service of their children as a sign of their own loyalty and Australian identities. In a letter from his solicitor to the Attorney General's Department, Giuseppe De Sisto of Roseville in New South Wales presented his son's enlistment in the Australian Army as evidence of loyalty to Australia and the war effort. Likewise, Paul Pantano expressed in his interment appeal how he both wished for and expected his son to serve their country. A Staff Sergeant Frank Perversi wrote of his hope that his enlistment would save his parents from any possible retribution from the general public, writing in his memoir that if their only son was serving in the 2nd AIF, they would surely be safe. The invocation of an Australian identity by Italian servicemen is particularly important, for although they did refer to their desire to serve and defend the British motherland, many wrote of their vehement loyalty to Australia in particular. In a letter written to Prime Minister Menzies, written less than a week after Italy declared war in June 1940, Signisada Pasquale Casella also wrote of his desire to do his duty in the Australian forces, along with the many Italians who he was sure, like himself, were ready and willing to give their all, and to prove they would defend this great and glorious land and not disgrace it. Staff Sergeant Frank Perversi similarly wrote that he enlisted to protect Australia. Had he known that Japan would enter the war, he would have enlisted later so he could fight in the Pacific rather than the Middle East where he was deployed. Ultimately, his loyalty and his claim to identity was not to Italy or even Britain, but to Australia. At the start of the war, Australia still tied its identity closely to its British origins, with military service specifically viewed as the sacred preserve of the independent Australian Britain. It would not be until the war broke out in the Pacific that this would change to a nationalist perspective within Australia. Although numerous Italian-Australian families cited military service as a sign of their continued allegiance to Australia, enlistment engendered a sense of betrayal for some. Staff Sergeant Perversi encountered the problems associated with this choice when telling his parents of his decision to enlist in the army. He noted that upon breaking the news of his enlistment to his parents, his father became irate at his son's decision to fight in the war against Italian counterparts. For his father, Perversi's enlistment represented a betrayal of his Italian identity and heritage. Of his parents' reaction to the news, Perversi wrote, "My mother did not mention the Italian aspect, but my father, feeling betrayed and deeply wounded, became extremely angry that I would volunteer to fight against my own flesh and blood, possibly even relatives." Indeed, Perversi himself noted that it would seem very off that he would volunteer to fight against Italians, given his background. However, military service represented a direct statement of his belief that he was Australian first and foremost. In his mind, while he was genetically of pure Italian descent as the son of Italian parents, he was born and raised in Australia, making him Australian. Though most used military service to emphasise and make a claim to an Australian identity, there were some who used it to challenge their treatment by the government. A New Guinea man used enlistment as a means of protesting his internment. Following the declaration of war between Italy and Australia, he was interned on suspicion that he was involved with the local fascist party in Australia. After months spent in an internment camp at Hay in New South Wales, he was finally approved for release upon one condition. He must enlist in either the Australian or the United States Army. In a final act of protest for his treatment, he chose to enlist in the United States Army, where he served in the Small Ships Division. Ultimately, Italian-Australian experiences during the Second World War demonstrate that a person's sense of identity is not static or fixed to metaphysical notions of identity as being tied to land and blood. Whether they chose to identify as Italian, Australian, or a hybrid of both was impacted by their generation, their geographical location, and most importantly, personal experience of prejudice and upbringing both prior to and during the war. The children of Italian migrants were more likely to claim an Australian identity than their Italian-born parents, while their parents often felt stronger ties to their Italian roots. However, this was not always the case, as personal experience played a large role in their sense of identity and sense of belonging. Finally, it should be noted that regardless of whether Italian Australians considered themselves to be Australian, the Italian-Australian community was largely aware of their status as foreigners. Frank Perversi noted that although he considered himself to be an Australian, he felt like an outsider amongst his classmates in his local area of Diamond Creek. I was conscious of the fact that we were regarded as foreigners, Dagos. Ultimately, although they themselves may have considered their identity to be Australian, they were aware that to the Australian community they would always be different and struggled with issues of a sense of not belonging, regardless of whether they were subjected to any outright anti-Italian behaviour.